You will not want to miss today's show. I'm Ryan Smith with Titan Protection, and we have Liz Forro, Director of Policy with the Commercial Drone Alliance, and we are talking all things Part 108. It is the end of May. We are expecting Part 108 to come out at any point, and we talk in detail about what we might expect, what she's seeing, what she's expecting. It's a conversation you won't want to miss. Welcome to the Titan Protection Show. Honored to be here with Liz Forro, Policy Director of the Commercial Drone Alliance. Liz, thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Ryan.
I'm sure you've been quite busy over the past, I was going to say a couple months, but probably a couple years.
Just a little.
Yeah. Love to hear a little bit about your background. Very impressive, but just kind of interested how you got started working with drones and kind of what led you to what you're doing now and the purpose behind the Commercial Drone Alliance.
Yeah, so most of my story is centered on being at the right place, the right time. When I was in grad school, I was really interested in how society and technology sort of interact with each other. At that time, it was around social media and misinformation and sort of what that means for society. In the real world, that translated into drones and how low altitude flying robots interact with society. So I spent about 10 years in the FAA and, was just kind of getting in there when it was organizing itself. The FAA was organizing its own efforts around drones. So right place, right time. And I got to work on some of the early Section 333 exemptions, and the first commercial approvals, helped, write the sort of foundational policy, that Part 107, was predicated on. So honestly, helping to sort of organize all of that, was incredibly, foundational to how I think about this space. And then getting to work on the Hill, getting to write the new entrance section and the reauth, and working with industry, I decided it was time to sort of see the problem from the other angle, and get into the industry side. I do really feel like in many ways we're sitting at this precipice of, of change for this industry. And so it's a really exciting time to be on the industry side, trying to help implement what we've, for the most part, just written so far.
Yeah, well, you've got an awesome perspective, and I'm smiling just because I have a grandfather that was my hero, and he worked at the FAA, and he got me kind of interested in aviation from an early perspective. But he started as a controller in the 30s, and then he became part of the administration. He was an architect of positive control, and also it's just very similar. I think about when they were back there trying to figure out, okay, now we have all these airplanes flying around. How do we control them, and how do we? And then here we are today, and working through that, and just seeing you kind of. In that perspective, it's just an awesome. And, as frustrated as everybody gets with the FAA and this process, look how well commercial aviation operates and those types of things. So I, as a commercial operator would love this to move as fast as possible. But I understand the FAA's perspective of how do we balance this and how do we not handcuff industry, be innovative, lean into it, but also do it in a safe way that everybody feels comfortable. So we're talking about drones, with robots and AI and everything that's happening in society. It's so important that we set the table right for that to be a very positive thing down the road. So you've got a interesting perspective on a lot of things. We were just talking about exponential. We're just a week off of that, and a lot of, I think, what was on our minds as we went to that show was Part 108 and how this is changing. We've operated, Part 107 with waivers and that type of thing. So there's a lot of uncertainty around what the future holds, and just kind of interested, Part 108, what do you expect? There was a lot of thought that Part 108, we've heard it's sitting on the Secretary's desk waiting for it to be signed. We thought maybe that was going to come out around exponential. Obviously, it did not. What are you seeing from your perspective as far as Part 108?
Yeah, so the Commercial Drone Alliance spends a healthy amount of time advocating on Part 108. We view it as very foundational, obviously, to the next stage of advancement for this industry. It is currently, we're all basically waiting for the Secretary to send it to the Office of Management and Budget, within the Executive Office of the President. Once it goes over to OMB, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, will run two kind of concurrent processes. One, they'll coordinate internally across the federal government. So all of the different departments and agencies that could have a stake in the rule will get to review it and provide comments back to the FAA. Simultaneously, OIRA runs a stakeholder engagement process, which is governed by Executive Order 12866. So you'll often hear the industry refer to this as 12866 meetings. So OIRA will welcome industry into 12866 meetings to provide feedback, thoughts, comments on the rule, on the proposal that we all saw. They do this at both the proposed rule and the final rule stage. So we all did this. Actually, we did this a couple times in the past 2 years, as the rule is coordinated twice. And now we're in the final rule stage. We are still waiting to hear, so CDA is talking to OIRA about how they're going to organize the industry meetings. We're hearing feedback that OIRA may want to work through trade associations. They may not necessarily want to do individual company meetings, but we're still waiting to hear kind of the timeline that they're going to be working under. Once the OIRA processes are complete, both the 12866 and the interagency review, they send the rule basically in its final form back to the FAA for final signature. So we're basically in this is to me, this is, kind of third base to home.
Right.
Like, we're in the home stretch of this process, and it's been a long time coming.
Oh, yeah. No, for sure. It'll be interesting to see. If you had a thought on timeline, what would your best guess be? And I know that can be a tough question.
I would say, I think a reach timeline, I think we could see it as soon as the summer,
okay.
Maybe end of the summer. I think a conservative timeline, I think we should certainly, I would hope to see it before the end of the year.
Right. With then 365 days to implement that and become compliant with that. Is that my understanding of the window is once released, you have a year to make it happen?
So the FAA may have multiple timelines, multiple implementation milestones within that rule. They really like 6 or 9 or 12 or 18-month timelines, but that's not to say that they couldn't be shorter or longer. There are certainly sometimes, I would expect some aspects of the rule potentially could be implementable within 30 days. I would expect others, obviously, to be more in the 12 to 18-month timeline. But as a reference, when the FAA came out with its ADS-B rule back in, I think, 2010, that was a 10-year implementation timeline. So, right, it doesn't need to just be a year. It could be longer. I certainly hope we are not looking or talking about a 10-year implementation timeline, though.
That would be interesting. Existing waiver holders, from our perspective, we had two things that we were really focused on in the comment period. And, some of the uncertainty is what happens to existing waiver holders, and are we taking steps backwards or, forwards with 108? Any thoughts on that, or heard anything on the existing waivers?
Yeah, I think that's going to be a big question. I think that will be part of the implementation timeline. I would expect, based on our experience with 107 and how we transitioned from the Section 333 exemptions into the 107 rule, I would expect the FAA will provide basically a transition window for waiver holders who can operate under 108. Mm-hmm. I know a lot of us, CDA included, provided some comments that perhaps some things that were happening under 107 didn't need to move to 108. They could continue operating under 107 with some tweaks to that rule. So I think we'll kind of have to see how the FAA draws the line between 107 and 108. In the proposal, they drew a very kind of strict line. Everything beyond visual line of sight would go under 108. I know CDA and several others commented that 108 was more written for, highly automated operations, less so for sort of a single, pilot potentially flying 2 to 3 miles away.
Right.
So we'll see where they draw the line in the final rule, but I think that transition period, I would expect that sort of, 6 to 12 month transition period, we'll get a lot of those questions answered too.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of goes into our other, point of what we were commenting on, and you nailed it there. It seemed like a lot of 108 was written with delivery in mind, and not in a bad way, or not that delivery was trying to dominate that conversation. I mean, they have spent a lot of time from a policy perspective and looking at that, and that seems to be a big use case. We were looking at it, and I see a very big difference between contained operations and uncontained operations. We operate for a security mission on a property that is closed, people aren't supposed to be on, so the risk is certainly a lot different than flying over people who may be non-participants, flying over long distances, even deconflicting with manned and other small, UAS. We're shielded. So, we were really hoping that there was some delineation there, because it just didn't feel like the risk picture, the risk profile, that type of thing was the same. I don't know if that resonated, or, it's kind of like you throw those things out there, but you don't know how much of that. And I really felt like from our particular industry, security, everybody's kind of sitting back watching from afar to wait and see how this shapes out. So they're really not voicing their opinions on things like this that are going to be very impactful. Is there any discussion? And I know agriculture and some other industries are kind of in that same spot. Was there any talk? Did you hear anything about kind of carving out things like that? Because that's my worry from the waiver perspective, is now we have to put expensive detect and avoid systems in that are really unnecessary if we're shielded at 50, 100 feet from the infrastructure around the property.
Yeah, I think that comment is generally in line with a lot of the industry feedback.
Good.
I think one of the things, so CDA said something along the same lines. We just said it in different language.
Right.
So our comment along those lines was the way the operations were allowed and the population densities were sort of dispersed. There really wasn't any opportunity for credit for, even if you were in a potentially populated area, if you were flying over no people.
Right.
That's a common, obviously, waiver holders know that's a very common mitigation today, is don't fly over people.
Right.
That way you're mitigating the ground risk. And there really was, the rule didn't really capture that concept in any way. There was no opportunity to sort of mitigate ground risk, not by airworthiness, but simply by not flying over people.
Right.
And I think we commented that absolutely. I know a lot of others commented. We all kind of used a different language to describe the same circumstances. Yeah. So I do think that is generally in line with what we saw from a broader industry perspective. Definitely.
Interesting. No, that's great, because there's a lot of different, and even like the population density. If we're only operating over a closed property that's fenced in, nobody's supposed to be in there, it's really not an applicable criteria to look at that space, because it's just not the same thing. But
Yep.
Good to hear, because that's kind of what we were wondering. It's like the way our waiver operates right now is perfect for what we need to do. We're just hoping we don't take steps backwards in that scenario. The other one being like, it seemed like they're very much trying to point the risk burden on entities, not individual pilots. And I think the mindset behind that is, if these are flying automated routes, there's not much the human pilot can do to intervene in those types of things. But for us, we need to take investigatory control at some point. If we see something as we're flying around and we need to provide overwatch or investigate a little bit more, we are going to have the need for a pilot to come in. And we've looked at that a little bit of going, okay, do we plan investigatory routes that we can then hit, that are already pre-planned, or, just trying to plan for some of that stuff. But it'll be really interesting to see. And I certainly look at this from a security only perspective, because that's the industry that we're in. So it's, are you seeing other industries that the FAA maybe thought we didn't consider this, or, that type of thing, as this is unraveled?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I very similar situation as the public safety, public safety, I'll call it an industry, but the public safety sort of sector. They have systems that will deploy and, they can use waypoints to sort of navigate. But at a certain point, if they're potentially chasing a suspect in a car or, through backyards, in an ideal situation, or at least I'll say today, they have a pilot sort of in a remotely, situated control station that's manually following that person.
Right.
I think, I think there is also a space between the sort of set it and forget it level of automation and the manually flying level of automation, that we want to make sure the rule recognizes that this isn't a binary issue, that there's actually a fair amount of space in between fully automated and highly autonomous, right? There's this highly autonomous space in there where there are many mechanisms and technologies that the industry has developed over the years to set it and sort of forget it, but not entirely.
Right.
And I think, for instance, we've seen, in the public safety space, there's follow me technology, right? Where the drone basically operator can pick a target and the drone can automatically follow that target and keep it within its camera view, right? So that is, just as an example, something where a pilot may not be fully necessary, but to what degree the human is in the loop versus on the loop, I think is a really fascinating, we're sort of reaching this fascinating precipice in the industry, where we have to figure out how highly automated and fully autonomous coexist in the same ecosystem.
No, 100%. You nailed a point there that I preach quite often is I think whether it's AI or robots or drones, I think we're jumping to full autonomy and missing the bionic age of man and woman and machine together. And I feel like we live in that space for quite some time, to be honest. And to a lot, what we do, that's our value proposition, is we're remote pilots in our operating center that are providing that. And even if the drone operates autonomously, there's still a last mile there where a human needs to take something, whether it be there's a problem with the drone or whether we see something on site that needs some sort of action, talking through it, calling the police, that type of thing. The human in the loop is still very important, and we feel that'll be, the case for quite some time. So it'll be interesting to see where they land. It sounds like, they're eyes wide open and ears wide open to the differences that they've heard, and it'll be interesting to see where they land on. Have you seen the Part 108? I mean, have you seen the proposed language of what's on the Secretary's desk? No, that they keep that all hidden behind the curtain.
They do a good job of making sure that the process stays fair. They do a good job of trying to broadcast. So while we don't know exactly what it says, we can, for instance, make some, I'll call them educated deductions from particularly the reopened comment period. So I think that's one of the first times actually that I've seen the FAA reopen a comment period for a rule in the fashion that they did. So for those who don't know, they reopened the rule for comment on a very narrow aspect of the rule around electronic conspicuity.
Right.
They gave us I think a 15 or 30 day window. I can't remember anymore. It happened so quickly. Right. And they asked for some specific feedback on specifically how electronic conspicuity would be implemented, how quickly electronic conspicuity devices could be available, what they would cost, what standards they would comply with. So from that comment period and the notice that came with that reopened comment period, one of the things that I think we can reasonably deduce is I would expect them leaning further into requiring universal electronic conspicuity, and moving perhaps a little bit away from detect and avoid requirements on drones. I think the context in which this rule is being finalized, we've got legislation on the Hill that's talking about basically increasing ADS-B out use. We've got a White House that has been very focused on airspace sovereignty and understanding absolutely everything that's going on in the airspace.
Right.
As if we view these kinds of efforts sort of holistically, we can clearly see the winds are blowing in, the direction of it may not be palatable anymore to be digitally or electronically invisible in the airspace. And what the future sort of looks like in terms of low altitude deconfliction, I think this rule could fundamentally change how drones and manned aircraft deconflict from each other.
Right.
I know CDA was very passionate on this point that it is past time for every aircraft to be electronically conspicuous. It's the reasonable regulatory foundation to have a cooperative airspace system, and that the idea at this stage, at this time of being non-cooperative in an airspace system is really kind of, it's dated.
100%.
There's too many airspace users. There's too much diversity in the airspace, and to enable the sort of highly autonomous future that I think we all are seeing and sort of working towards, we have to enable machines to talk to machines to some extent, or at least to detect them. So I think this is I think if I was gonna look at my crystal ball about one big thing that I would think is going to change, that's probably what one thing I would target based on that reopened comment period. I think we can make some reasonable deductions.
And do you think that will center around ADS?
I think it could. I think that is one of the most viable technologies in terms of electronic conspicuity that exists today. Now, that's not to say that it's the only one that it exists. There are a lot of different capabilities. At the end of the day, a lot of it is about simply the band of spectrum that you're sort of communicating on. So there are, I think, several available. I think at the end of the day, the fastest way to sort of implement something like that is to use what we already have and enable flexibility for the future.
Right.
So CDA's position on this has very much been, there should be a regulatory construct that allows for multiple technologies, multiple standards, but at the end of the day, everyone needs to be conspicuous in the airspace, and drones are conspicuous. We have broadcast remote ID.
Right.
We would also be required to equip with ADS-B in. And so I think the fairness of the airspace system sort of starts to dictate, okay, so for manned aircraft, how are you playing in this space? What are you bringing to the table?
Right.
And I think we'll see what's in the final rule, but I'm hopeful that we see a little bit more in terms of parity for equipage requirements.
Yeah. Well, and then you have, ADS-B is required in Bravo, Delta, Charlie airspaces, but not in G. So you have a crop duster flying around and he's not required. That's never made sense to me, flying manned aircraft if let's do it. If we're going to do it, let's do it all. And then I know the AOPA has been very negative on that piece because they feel like it's data collection and they're using that for fines and for different stuff like that. But I am with you. I'm in the, we have to center around something. And if it's ADS-B, that's a lot easier for us than it is to put up detect and avoid radar systems just to fly around to watch for manned aircraft that may, I've always had that. If I'm flying shielded at 50 feet and you're, a pilot flying an aircraft and you're within 50 feet of the building, my drone is the least of your concerns if you're that low and that, that issue. But any thoughts? Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, and, with increasing electronic conspicuity, the whole NAS, right, the whole National Airspace System, we raise the safety bar for everyone,
right, not
just for the drone community. So I think that's also, from a cost-benefit analysis standpoint, that's also a huge benefit. There's some unequipped aircraft. There's not a lot left, right, honestly. There's only a couple tens of thousands. So at this point, like, let's increase the overall safety bar, and benefit everybody.
100%. No, I totally agree. Are you, in your crystal ball, seeing anything as far as that detect and avoid piece? Because that's the big one we're looking at from a step backwards from our waiver, is having to implement additional equipment at sites we're already operating at to, combat that. What's your feeling, just gut-wise, on where that's going to end up with the final rule?
So, again, I think you can do a little bit of reading into the public notice on the reopened comment period. The FAA did have a paragraph of discussion on that aspect of the requirement. I think it was an interestingly worded paragraph. So I do highly recommend going and reading that paragraph, because it said something to the effect similar to the points that you've made about several of the manned community pushing for drones to have an ability to detect and avoid non-cooperative aircraft, and the public notice pointed that out and said, yes, these communities have strongly supported having a DAA requirement, but they fail to address the challenges with that technology that the drone community has raised. And so the FAA in that paragraph is kind of pointing out a discrepancy that people who want to require a non-cooperative DAA capability for drones aren't really addressing the challenges that we've all identified, to your point, exactly what you've said, with actually implementing that.
Right.
So I think I don't necessarily have a crystal ball on that issue. I will say the more universal electronic conspicuity is, the less necessary non-cooperative DAA becomes.
Right. No, I totally agree. And then I'm just wondering, is that, I feel like, I totally agree. I feel like it's the right thing to do. Implementing that as a whole nother thing, because then you're pulling in manned aircraft and Part 91 and 135 and all the other pieces but I think the FAA is eyes wide open to the fact that there's almost no way not to look at the airspace that way, and all these. This is just we're in a different ball game at this point. You can't apply the old rules. Kind of the same thing with Part 107 to Part 108, as a lot of it was built on manned aircraft, and we're just in a new world. We're in a new generation of it, for sure.
Absolutely.
Anything we're leaving on the table as far as, I come from Part 108 from a very specific lens, how we operate for security missions and that type of thing. Mm-hmm. One of the things I thought, too, that was interesting about Part 108, when we talk about beyond visual line of sight, you need a docking station and you need a security or you need an operations center to operate them from. We've operated our security operations center for several years. So we have things like redundant power, backup generators. That never really got discussed in the notice to propose rulemaking or any of that. Really, kind of what happens if you lose power at your facility or anything like that. Is there any big items that you think are coming down with 108 or that haven't been discussed or seem kind of fleshed out? Anything we're leaving out on the Part 108 discussion?
No, I think. Maybe I'll add the other part of the proposal, which was Part 146, which I think is actually easily overlooked by the drone community, but I think is actually a really critical aspect of that low altitude ecosystem that we're building towards. I see two things converging. So I see, the FAA proposed a Part 146, which is, they created a new regulation and a new type of regulated entity. That's a really big deal. Yeah. Even Part 108 had the standard, you're an operator or you're a manufacturer, and that's pretty typical, right, in aviation. Part 146 created a new concept of automated data service provider. That's a new type of regulated entity the FAA only sort of touches today in a very kind of informal process. But these are basically the service providers that are building the low altitude, UTM ecosystem that we're all eventually going to need as the airspace, grows denser and we have higher volumes of operations. How are we going to manage drone to drone deconfliction? Right. And so the strategic deconfliction requirement in 108 being implemented through Part 146 service providers. I mean, this is, I'm not sure if folks realize that we're already kind of doing this today. There is a US UTM implementation cohort that is building out this ecosystem today. And they are basically setting the foundation for what that data architecture is eventually going to look like. And they're largely doing it, through a self-governance model, with sort of legally binding self-accountability agreements between each other. And some FAA oversight, kind of on top. So it's sort of functioning like the FAA provides them with a homework assignment. They go, off and solve the homework problem, and then they bring the FAA the homework and show them their work. And the FAA sort of blesses it and says yes or, no, go back and try again. And that group's setting a very high safety bar for themselves today. And they're doing a lot of work that, maybe once we have 146 and the FAA has a mechanism to regulate these entities, the FAA will take some of that responsibility. Right. But I think it's really exciting to see this being built out today. And the other sort of half of this is the new proposal that we just got, 2 weeks ago, the Section 2209 Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, which to me is exciting in that it is starting to bring the counter-drone and drone industries together into the same conversation. And I'm not going to comment on the rule itself, but to me, just the fact that the FAA is saying, we're willing to restrict airspace over certain facilities, but we also recognize that, drones are aircraft, and there's a right to navigable airspace for all members of the public. And how do we start to balance this ecosystem and enable people on the ground to basically distinguish unauthorized and authorized drones? To me, I think this is really exciting because the CDA represents both the sort of drone, security and counter drone space, as well as drone operators and manufacturers. And for the most part, these conversations have kind of been happening in two separate rooms. Yeah. And I feel like we're removing the divider between the room and we're starting to have the same conversation together. And I think that's really what's going to drive this low altitude ecosystem forward, is having the folks who need to protect things and the folks who need to fly things, having their data systems talk to each other, right? Because we're not going to get to the scale that we want to get to unless we have systems talking to systems rather than just people talking to people. Right. And figuring out, to your point, what the role of the human is in that ecosystem. To me, right, we're right back to where I started, right? Which is, how do we sort of walk the bridge between technology and society, and how do we create that intersection in a safe, harmonious, and sort of societally beneficial way? Yeah,
no, it's a big conversation to throttle for sure. And does Part 146 kind of tie back into that EC conversation of what we're all trying to figure out is kind of what led back to the, when manned aircraft was flying around, how do we keep track of these things so that it's safe for people to operate there? It seems to be that's the big thing that everybody's wrestling with and trying to trying to solve. So it's definitely a big conversation and one to get right for sure. But very interesting to see kind of a peek behind the scenes there. What's next on the horizon for CDA? I know obviously there's a lot of talk here with regulations and that type of thing. Is there anything else that's kind of top of mind for the Commercial Drone Alliance going into the last half of the year?
Yeah, I think we've got a couple things. So obviously we're working on our comments to the 2209 NPRM. We'll be working with our members, again, on both sides, right? I love being able to bring everyone into that conversation about what they think this ecosystem could look like, what they want it to look like. And then, of course, we've still got, on the sort of purely counter UAS side, we've got the FIFA World Cup coming up. We've got a lot of our members who are helping to protect stadiums and event spaces for that. We also have potentially another $250 million worth of grants from I think they'll be coming out through DHS for additional counter drone technologies across the country. So we're going to try to help make sure that our members know when that's coming and how to potentially participate in that process. I'm sure there will be other surprises. I think, we're obviously very hyper-focused on Part 108 as well, and Part 146, and getting those rules, both getting them right, but then also there's an enormous effort in terms of implementation of those rules that we're also focused on. So we are supporting right now we're supporting ASTM, which is one of the industry consensus standards bodies, who are developing the standards that are going to be the means of compliance for that 108 rule. They're frantically working on the standards to make sure that the drone industry has something basically to build on once we see the rule in its final form. So we've got a lot going on. And of course, personally, as you can probably tell, I am very jazzed about that low altitude ecosystem and that sort of UTM work that's going on. We're supporting that cohort to the greatest extent that we can in terms of educating people. A lot of it's education right now to make sure that folks just know what's going on. Because I think at the end of the day, their solution set is going to solve a variety of problems, sort of in terms of externalities, right? So they're building what they need to operate safely, but that doesn't mean that there aren't, additional benefits for other stakeholder groups coming out of that. So a lot of education, a lot of advocacy, just a lot to do.
Yeah, no, well, you said it best, and I really appreciate what you do, because y'all have you take a lot of different perspectives from industry, you help gather those together, and then kind of that liaison with the federal side and help working through all this. It's, from anybody being on the outside looking in, it's such a heavy lift, and so many different stakeholders that have valid and very good, reasons for all of this. It can be a clunky process, but I agree with you. It's really exciting to be at this point in the conversation, and even just being able to fly and operate under the waiver side of things, it just feels like, I've been following drones since 2012, and, the last 18 months has had so much movement in it and so much change, and it just feels like there's so much energy and, momentum behind it. And I know y'all have been a big part of that. So I certainly appreciate everything you do.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, Liz, thanks for coming on. Any final thoughts? Check out, we'll certainly post your LinkedIn and links to Commercial Drone Alliance, but really appreciate you having on. Any items to leave us with?
Buckle up.
Yep.
A lot of change coming.
It's going to be an interesting ride and very exciting. So again, thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Liz.
It's great to see you.